Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival from Diggy Palace, of course protected by Dettol. It's our pleasure to present today The Art of the Novel, Annie Zaidi, Colum McCann and Colm Tóibín, Jeet Thayal in conversation with Moin Mir. Where does fiction come from? What is the process of its creation? How do you make up characters and situations that are believable? And why should the reader care? 5 of the world's leading novelists, Annie Zaidi, Colm Tóibín, Colum McCann and Jeet Thayal, share their insights on the art of the novel with Moin Mir. Annie Zaidi is the author of Bread, Cement, Cactus, a memoir of belonging and dislocation, Prelude to a Riot, Gulab, Love Stories of 1 to 14, and the editor of Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing. She is the recipient of the 2020 Tata Literature Live Award for Fiction, the 9 Dots Prize in 2019, and the 2018 Hindu Playwright Award for her play Untitled 1. Colum McCann is the National Book Award winning author of several novels and 3 collections of stories. He is the co-founder of Narrative 4, a global non-profit. His work has been published in over 50 languages. Colm Tóibín is the author of 10 novels including The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Book Award, The Testament of Mary, and Nora Webster, as well as 2 short story collections and several books of criticism. He is the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. 3 times shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, Tóibín lives in Dublin and in New York. Jeet Thayal, poet, musician and novelist, is the editor of the Penguin Book of Modern Indian Poets, forthcoming in 2021. His 4 novels include the bestseller Necropolis and most recently Names of the Women, a retelling of the New Testament from the points of view of the women whose roles were suppressed, reduced or erased from the Gospel. Moin Mir is a London-based writer of Indian origin. Mir is the author of the critically acclaimed book Surat, Fall of a Port, Rise of a Prince. His upcoming book is a historical novel set against the backdrop of Sufism and its philosophies. The book will be published in June 2021. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, The Art of the Novel, Annie Zaidi, Colm McCann, Colm Tóibín and Jeet Thayal in conversation with Moin Mir. Moin, over to you.
It really is a dazzling constellation of novelists and writers that we have today to discuss the art of the novel. I'd like to begin actually with Colm Tóibín. Colm, just to get started in terms of the novel, how does it actually germinate? Is your mind actively seeking the novel? Or is it, is your mind languidly absorbing world affairs? How does and where does a novel germinate from?
Oh, it's lovely. The idea of languidly observing world affairs is so beautiful. I think something starts slowly when you're least expecting it. That if you seek it, if you say, today I'm going to start thinking of a novel, I need a subject, it won't come or it will look forced. That in other words, in that ordinary day, something small occurs to you and it grows. From my point of view, I don't ever take notes because if you can't remember something, it's obviously of no importance and you're better to forget it. Sure. So that taking of notes looks like something, I'll forget this. So that something therefore begins organically. Yeah. And when you least expect it, it moves. Sure. And then it could move again. So you have something. Now, there's something could be a configuration, just something that's happening in a room. Someone arriving in someone's house and finding their socks have fallen down and just lifting their socks up. And that moment of lifting someone just a man lifting his socks up. You can that second. Yeah. In a room. Who else is in the room? And what happens then is that moves of its own accord into melody. In other words, that you get a sentence. Yeah. You get a sound. You get a moment where the 2 things have merged, the scene that you have imagined and language in rhythm. And you get that only once. So that if you keep waiting for that to come another time, it won't. You have to work then. The only thing to do then, once you have that, is work. So that's for me how it starts. It ceased to be mysterious. It just seems to be an ordinary thing, and it's very close to childhood, where you often imagine everything. You think you could be a giant, or you don't mind if a story isn't true, as long as it's interesting. I think that business of it being interesting in some way or other, rhythmically interesting, or that something is of interest. In other words, it's a form of communication. For me, it just doesn't exist as a form of self-interrogation or sort of ways of exploring myself. You know, I know there are writers who say, I write for myself. Well, I don't need that. You know, I've got enough to read. Thank you. You know, and therefore, it's a form of communication. It's the basic business that every other guy has gone out hunting. And I'm alone in the cave. They've left me behind in the cave. And my job in the cave is to represent with some beautiful lines what it is they're doing when they go hunting. So it seems to be a basic thing that people do in civilization. They pick one guy, one girl, one person, and that person represents the world that people live in to themselves in some way or other, using line, using language, or using sound.
Fantastic. That's absolutely fabulous, Colm. Thank you for that. I just want to take the same question further to Annie. Annie, is there something like, you know, a nothingness of mind that exists from where, you know, an image can actually start taking root and then kind of proceed towards becoming a thought or a you know or a sign that kind of comes up in a state of nothingness of mind? Does that actually happen?
It's an interesting and a difficult question, nothingness of mind, because I'm not sure. I mean, this is one of the things that, you know, people seeking nirvana do, seeking a kind of nothingness of the mind. It's damn difficult. I can't claim to ever have achieved any kind of nothingness of mind. But I will echo what Colm was just saying. I think what happens is that things strike you. I mean, the example he gave was something as small as a man picking his socks up off the floor. For me too, sometimes things just startle me, you know, things like you see a man sitting under a highway bridge or sleeping under a bridge with, you know, a baby. Or you see a woman traveling very late alone at night, and something about her manner, you know, something either remarkably relaxed or remarkably kind of tense will trigger something. And that something doesn't necessarily have to do with the reality of that woman's life. It may have something to do with like decades of conditioning in my mind, right? And it might have something to do with what I'm reading in the papers. And there is a kind of collision that happens. It's like this accident. And then it kind of brews and brews, at least in my mind. It's very rare for me to see something and come back home immediately and go off into this fictional kind of just take off into this creative frenzy. What happens usually is that it happens and then the image just sits there. It sits and sits and sits until it reaches its own kind of happenstance. And that starts to suggest to me a story. And I kind of search around in the dark for it. There is a moment, mostly in the middle of me writing, there is usually a moment where I don't really know what I'm doing. And that is a kind of creative nothingness, if I can call it that, because when I come up against that nothing, or nowhere further to go, then I have to seek ways. Now what do I do? Now where does this go? And then something happens. Something suggests itself, and that becomes fiction.
Fabulous. Annie, thank you for that. I'm just going to read a short passage from one of our panelists' novels. And I'm sure as soon as I've read a couple of sentences, you will guess who it is. But it grabbed me, and it was just absolutely fabulous. I thought, for every happiness, there is an equal and opposite unhappiness. Then I took a drag of charas, and the room filled with light. Everything was transparent. The skin on my arms was thin as paper. I looked into my flesh and saw the moving bones wrapped in pink translucent sheets. And all the while the rain fell in great washes against the roof, sheets of water that streamed from the window and gathered in the corners of the room. We smoked that dirty hash. I wanted to hold the city, each woman and child and animal and man. I wanted to save them. And then I saw Dimple on the balcony reading a book, squinting as if her life depended on the words. I went to say goodbye, and she whispered something in my ear. She said, "Take me with you. I'll die if I stay." This is from a book which is Narcopolis by Jeet Thayil, truly a masterpiece. It took me into a space, and it held me in that space. And that space became a place from which I didn't want to leave. It took me a long time to make myself want to leave that space. So I want to bring Jeet into this conversation. Jeet, writing a novel many times is a process of deep inward contemplation and then external experimentation and crystallization of thoughts and words. It's apparent from the passage that I read that this internal contemplation within you and then this external writing, has been a journey. But what I'd like to know is, do you see this inward and external journey as a beautiful struggle, Jeet?
It's certainly a struggle. I don't know if, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a beautiful struggle. It is often frustrating and often full of doubt, and you don't know why you do it day after day. But this is what we do. I would have no other reason really to get up and go through a day if I didn't, at some point, even if it's not very long, just struggle with a paragraph or a sentence. And I think there are two kinds of novelists, and I've been both. I started out as one, and now I'm the other. I started out as the kind of novelist who has no idea what he or she is doing and learns as they write the book and as they work through those sentences and paragraphs and chapters what the book is about. The book reveals itself as you work on it. And I think this is probably why Narcopolis took 5 years and the book that followed took 6 years.
Yeah.
At this point, I approach a book with much more of an idea of what it's going to look like, what the beginning and the middle and the end will be. And because of that, it takes a year or two at the most. And I think, taking 5 or 6 years for a novel it might just be a self-indulgent,
Yeah. And while you're going through that process, Jeet, do you see beauty in that? I know you said it's not necessarily something that you might see it initially, but during that process, at some point, do you realize that, it's exceptionally beautiful what you've written. Do you realize that you've written something beautiful?
Thank you for saying that. I really don't. I think when you were reading that to me just now, I wrote that, more than 10 years ago. So I haven't heard it or read it in a decade. And parts of it did strike me as well-turned sentences. But certainly when I was working on it, that never struck me. And I think there are moments when you work on a book and you write chunks of it, and then you go back, and there are passages that stay with you.
Yeah.
And I don't think they strike me as beautiful at the time. They just please me for about 5 minutes.
Great. Fabulous. I just want to come to Colum McCann. Colum, on a more philosophical note, why do we writers write fiction? Is it because it gives us the sense of freedom to comment on society or explore questions regarding man's nature, his actions? A more philosophical question. Why do we write fiction?
I don't know the answer to the question, and that's the honest to God truth. I mean, part of me writes because I absolutely have to. But when I think, I don't think in big thematic concerns. I think to be too acutely conscious of what you want to do and what you want to say brings a sort of illness to your work. And I wanted to pick up on what Annie was saying, that some of the time you're just operating on fumes, but also what Colum and Jeet were saying, that there is an idea there, and sometimes we write to uncover what it is that we know. A lot of writing teachers will say to you, "Well, you should write what you know," and they are entirely correct. But I'm very interested in writing towards what you don't know, or interested in writing towards what you supposedly don't know. And in making that leap, you understand things that you knew but you weren't entirely aware of. But going for a big theme at the beginning would seem to me to be the wrong direction to go. And often I will say this, that it is the reader that uncovers what the magic and the mystery have done to the writer. So the reader brings the intelligence to the work. And I know that people like Nabokov used to say, "Well, my characters are my galley slaves. They do what I want them to do." But for me, that it doesn't work that way. I'm sort of inside it, and I'm sort of constantly surprised by it, and what it uncovers. And so I think you write towards your obsessions, and sometimes you write to get rid of your obsessions, and sometimes you write to entertain, and sometimes you write to tell yourself a story that you want to hear yourself 10 years down the line. I was just recently, I'll finish with this. I was just recently rereading Colum's Heather Blazing, which is a book that's many years old right now, and it's so beautiful, and it echoes with me, and all the images still echo with me of the houses in Ireland, and the disappearance into the sea, and just simply the creation of music, as he was talking about that beautiful musical moment that resonates with me and will resonate with me forever. So I become alive in a body that's not my own, in a time that's not my own, in a town that's not necessarily my own, but I become me, and that's one of the beauties of writing.
Beautiful, beautifully put. But I just want to take this question to Annie and Colm very quickly. Annie, why do we write fiction? Do we have something to say? Does it give us? I mean, of course, we've got something to say, but does it give us freedom to comment on society or explore man's nature? Annie, your thoughts?
No, I think I write fiction when I can't write anything else, to be honest. Because I was a working journalist and I write for a living, and fiction doesn't pay. So there's no good reason for me to write fiction, honestly. And poetry really works much better for just pure catharsis and self-expression.
Sure.
So my feeling is, I speaking for myself, I think I write fiction when I'm trying to resolve something. I often operate in the dark. My writing is not plot-driven. I don't always know where the story is going. I don't know my characters very well necessarily, or I do know them, but I don't yet know how to know them. Yeah. So when I start writing, the writing itself is my act of figuring things out. And to that extent, I do write for myself, because in the writing, many things, I kind of know what I want to say, and I kind of also know what's happening around me. Sometimes the only way to know what's actually happening in my own head is for me to try and write fiction.
Sure.
A lot of times my fiction doesn't go anywhere, doesn't come together, and I have to abandon it, but that's fine. I do it because it's helping me figure something out. I think that is my primary motivation.
Colm?
I suppose if you think about it, that if you're in a room or a place and someone says, there's somebody over in the corner, or there's somebody up at the bar, there's someone at the table, and she's a great singer, and you watch her and you think, is she going to sing? Is there some point of the evening where someone will ask her to sing and she might sing? And that idea, I suppose, it's like a child, you give a child crayons and the child would immediately start to draw.
Yeah.
That it is instinct, that idea of telling a story, making a drawing or singing a song. It comes out of something essential in the self. And then some people grow up and keep at it.
Yeah.
And it often arises, from what Colm McCann said, this strange neurosis. I mean, what I'm saying strange neurosis, but Colm's talking about things you don't know, things you think you know, and then when you start exploring, you realize, I didn't know I knew that.
Sure,
and that's a great mysterious thing. If you suddenly find it with a character or with an image or even with a version of the world.
Yeah.
I didn't know that version of the world could be put into sentence like I've just done. Yeah. So it's curious.
Jeet, why do we write fiction?
Such a impossible question. I mean, I think.
Sorry.
Also, it's the flip side of the other part of this panel. The question of the many questions that ends the section about this panel, which is, why should we care?
Yeah.
I think those two questions are absolutely, they're the same side of two coins or two sides of one coin.
Mm-hmm.
We write because that is all we can care about. And I think if you're a reader, and of course, if you're a writer, you will be a reader. But if you're a reader who doesn't write, at this point, we all know how important a story is.
Yeah.
How important it is to read something. And I think that at this point, of course, it's intensified. It's an extreme moment that we're living through right now, and books matter to us, stories matter to us in a way that they might not have earlier. But writers and readers have always known this. The obsessed writers, the obsessed readers have always known this. And that is the stories that we tell each other, the stories that continue our culture and our civilization wherever we might be placed. This really is it's the most important thing we can do. And I hope I don't sound like a kind of a pompous writer by saying that. I'm trying to say that it's actually a humbling and human endeavor.
Sure. Yes, it is. It is. I agree. It can be very humbling because you realize certain elements of your own self, and as well as, people that are around you whom you're engaging with, or characters that you're engaging with, and it can be an extremely humbling experience. I think that's a very important aspect that you spoke about. It can be extremely humbling. Just want to go back to Colum McCann. They say novelists at some point in time during the writing of their book, of their novel, at some point in time, they say, develop some kind of a relationship with their reader. I mean, they've not really engaged with their reader, but while they're writing, they've kind of created some kind of a relationship with their reader. At that time, Colum, how do you balance between imagination and description? And what I mean by that is, in other words, how do you decide on how much to describe and how much to leave to the reader's imagination?
Well, I finished a novel. My most recent novel was called A Paragon, and it's set in Israel and Palestine. And anyway, it took 5 years to write. And for 2 years, I had no clue who the narrator was. I was partly the narrator, but I bore myself. I'm like what Colm says. I don't want to write about myself. I don't want to write about my life walking around the reservoir in New York or anything like that. I didn't want to be the narrator of this book. And I was terrified, quite frankly. How can you spend 2 years, be in the middle of a book and not know who's telling the actual story? And then something happened to me, and I realized that the narrator of the book was actually the reader. Now, I didn't know whether this was a moment of great revelation or if it's the stupidest, most obvious thing that every single book is narrated by the reader herself or himself. But for me, I actually made the reader complicit in the act and the art of reading, and I sort of named them as the narrator. And so that was really interesting. So then this tension between what to describe and what not to describe. What do they know and what do they not know? I think of myself sometimes as a language camera. You know, I've got to go into a room, and what does I do with the camera to reveal what is there without telling people what they should know about the place? And so without being didactic, you allow people. See, what's really boring is when we get told how to feel. I get told what to think. But if we're allowed to think, that's when we're being generous with our reader. So when I think about my reader, I think about him or her as coming into the same room as me, experiencing the same thing as me, but being more intelligent than me, or getting different things from the room than I actually do. And then they have a sort of human experience there that sort of expands the lungs of their lives. And that's what it's all about.
Wonderful. Fabulous. I want to talk about this one word that I've kind of heard you use in the past, but I think it's so important that some of our viewers, hear this again from you. How do we maintain a rhythm in a novel? Keeping in mind changing landscapes, situations, characters, developments, all of character developments. How does one maintain a rhythm in a novel?
I think the first thing is that there are no rules, and that the novel is a hybrid form. It comes from many sources. The sources including the confession, the sermon, the folk tale. That all of that merges in this form, which one of the reasons why it survived is that it's an open form. In other words, it can be all voice. That the rhythm can just establish voice. The rhythm can break. That you can have many different stories being told in different rhythms, all in the same book. So that it isn't as though you're a singer and you find a key and you sing in that key and you don't go out of that key, you don't go out of tune in a book. Because I think in a novel, in the 18th century and in the 20th century, you could go out of key. Part of the deal was to go out of key as often as possible to see what would happen. And that's how the imagination works. But for example, in a short story, you or in many short stories, you need a beginning where there's a sound. And you work with that sound in your ear in some strange way that you're holding and wielding a rhythm. And often the action of the story, and indeed of the chapter of the novel, it doesn't really matter if there's no car crash, if there's no war breaking out or bomb exploding. That's something very intimate, because we keep working as novelists with the intimate, with the tiny thing that needs to be registered, that will in some way or other hold power over the reader's imagination. A novel is 1,000 details, say, but it's also 1,000 clues. In other words, it's not like a film where you can show the room, every color, every detail, what someone's nose was like. That you don't give everyone's nose in every sentence of a novel. So you're constantly just giving the reader enough clues. And sometimes the rhythm can carry the emotion. And you don't need to put in the words around emotion, that you just let the rhythm do the work. And so it's a form of tact. It's the same form of tact as you would use in conversation. of almost letting the other person speak, or eye contact, or all those things we do with manners in a public space or even in a private one. All of those really can be applied to fictional systems. And that, yes, you work all the time. You have all your characters and all your sentences, but there's another element, which is the reader, that you're always thinking, how much does the reader need to know here? Is this paragraph too long? Have I said too much? Do I need one more clue to give the reader one more way into this? And so you're always thinking about the work as a form of communication.
And I like the word clue to kind of lead into something else which the reader has not really been able to anticipate, but there's a clue there, so that he's searching for the next. Jeet, I want to take this same question to you, because I was amazed by a particular part in Narcopolis, just keeping rhythm in mind. There's a part in the book where we are with one of your characters, Lee. And then suddenly you cut very beautifully and very interestingly to a situation where you're back in Bombay, and there is a song that is being played out of Guru Dutt's movie Pyasa, and that's a fabulous transition. It's the rhythm is, I mean, there is a transition in the book, but the rhythm is so beautiful, and you've transited, or you've taken the reader into this new landscape so seamlessly. So in your mind, tell us about rhythm again. How do you keep rhythm in the novel?
Sure. Just before I get to that, picking up on what Colm said about clues, I would also like to offer the idea that fiction is a form of concealment, that we are also trying to hide things. And often the most powerful kind of short story or novel is when you know that the writer is skirting around a topic, is actually giving you clues to something that is being hidden very carefully throughout the length of the novel. And that imbues it with a kind of a sinister power that I think we've all felt as readers.
Yes.
To talk about rhythm, thanks for pointing out the rhythm of Narcopolis. I don't think I've worked as hard on rhythm as I have in that book. And because at that time, I really didn't make much of a distinction between poetry and prose. I was coming to prose as a poet. I'd written 5 books of poems, and this was the first novel I was working on. It was late in my life. I was 45 when I began to work on fiction. And so I really didn't see any kind of dichotomy between those two types of language. And so for me, Narcopolis really was about rhythm. And it was also about the idea of a novel where there's a reason novel is called a novel. We can do anything with novels.
Sure.
It's absolutely true that there are no rules, which is why in Narcopolis, for 50 pages, you go into the mind, into the history of a character in China. During the war, Mao's war, he escapes from China and then returns, and then the story returns to Bombay. For 50 pages, it's in China. And if you were to say this to a MFA teacher, I'm sure they would say that's not a very good idea. Focus on your Bombay story. Don't digress.
Sure.
But I would again offer one word: Dostoevsky. Long before there were editors who shut down your ideas, he was a man who would digress for 100 pages about God.
Yeah.
And that really is the beauty of fiction.
Yeah.
You can do anything as long as you carry your reader with you. And like musicians, what we have at our hand, at our command, to carry the reader with us,
beautiful,
is plot, is language, is ideas, and most of all is rhythm. And when you have sort of hit people, some writers call it voice. It is really an idea of rhythm. You know when you've hit that vein in the book that will carry you to the end, when you get into the rhythm that takes you over. And at that point, it's no longer about you. You are just following where that rhythm will take you. And I think that really, at that moment, is often the most gratifying process in the often painful process of writing a book.
Okay, brilliant. Just wanted to talk a little bit about characters. I'm just going to read a short passage from a novel, which I enjoyed thoroughly. They cut her hair before they dragged her to the place of sacrifice. My daughter had her hands tied tight behind her back, the skin on the wrists raw with the ropes, and her ankles bound. Her mouth was gagged to stop her cursing her father, her cowardly, two-tongued father. Nonetheless, her muffled screams were heard when she finally realized that her father really did mean to murder her, that he did mean to sacrifice her life for his army. It's a fantastic and deeply, deeply emotional passage from Colm Tóibín's House of Names. And it really struck deep, Colm, that particular passage. And I want to ask you, how do you give a first-person voice to a female character and infuse such intense emotion in that, to bring that character alive right at the beginning of the novel?
A number of ways. The first one is I think literary, where in the Greek texts, in Medea, in Electra, in Antigone, when the woman speaks, it's filled with texture, and when the king speaks, it's filled with the sound of legislation. In other words, there's a dry sound when the men speak, and when the woman speaks, because often they speak out of powerlessness. The powerlessness gives their speech a power. That is where their power lies, in the texture of their speech. So I sort of studied this, and I became interested in other texts in which a tone can be used, which I would call first-person staccato, which you would find, for example, in Sylvia Plath. You find it in Joan Didion. You find it in Elizabeth Hardwick. You find it in Louise Glück. And so I was interested in getting this first-person staccato and applying it then to allowing Clytemnestra from the Oresteia to actually tell the story herself in a voice. When I say her own voice, that's not necessarily true, because it's a very public voice. It's a voice of someone who may not get to speak again. The whole idea I had was that she may speak only once. And this is her moment, and so everything will be spoken in a sort of heightened, dramatic way. I was also using the idea of sound in the theatre as well. I wrote all that stuff at about each day at about 4 o'clock in the morning. I mean, before anyone else was up, like for those hours in the middle of the night. That particular section was written. I hope not to do this ever again.
I wanted to ask you, while a writer is progressing through his work, he or she is going through a changing state of mind. As the novel is progressing, he or she the state of mind is changing. How important or not important, is it to use that state of mind to infuse characters and to give characters a voice? Is there a danger of giving characters your own voice?
Well, there is and there isn't. I think ultimately it is all your own voice. And yet, in my case particularly, it isn't, because especially with the last novel, it is written entirely as a set of soliloquies. And these are all internal monologues. And the reason I ended up writing a novel at all, I had no intention of writing one, was that I was hearing a lot of things that were being said to me and about me and around me. And I didn't know what to do with these things. these words that had been put out there. And for a long time, I just took notes, just exactly the same words to, like a journalist, I just made notes, and these voices just sat on my laptop for months. And at first I thought maybe write an essay. I didn't know what to do. Then I thought maybe write a play. Then I thought maybe write a short story. I'm terrified of novels. I do not like the idea of novels. It's too big and it's too frightening, and you do a lot of work. So I was very reluctant to do that kind of work at all.
Yeah.
But I do think that once I decided on the form that now I'm going to write this as a set of internal monologues, and I started to split it up based on the things I'd actually heard, people I'd seen, people I thought were more or less like the people I had seen. Once I started to write their internal monologue, they did take some of my voice. It is inevitable. I cannot write interiority without giving it some of mine. At the same time, I did draw very strongly upon my own awareness of life, times, language, the way people speak, accents, dialects, the way you can tell class, the way you can tell through pronunciation, the way things are betrayed. So I work a lot with accents and sounds and people's conversations. I'm a note taker, essentially. So wonderful. I think a lot of that is just that.
Great. I have to read another small passage because this moved me immensely. In fact, it brought a tear to my eye. And Abir was 10 years old. She was coming out of the tin-roofed shop with Irene and 2 friends. It was just after 9 in the morning. The winter sun shone slant. School was in break time for an hour. They were just about to return for a maths test, multiplication tables. 12 times 8, 96. 12 times 9, 108. When the armored jeep turned the corner, the girls began to run. The bullet was metal at the core, but tipped with a special vulcanized rubber. When it hit Abir's skull, the rubber deformed slightly, but then bounced back to its original shape without any evident damage to the bullet itself. The border guard who fired the shot was 18 years old. This is a passage from Colum McCann's recent novel, A Paragon. And it's, I hope I've pronounced it correctly. It's a startling story of Rami, a Jew, and Bassam, an Arab Muslim, both who lose their daughters to this bloody conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But it's also a great hymn to reconciliation and peace and harmony. And it struck me very deep, this passage in your book, Colm. Why did you write this book?
Well, I met these 2 extraordinary men, Rami and Bassam. They're real. I met them in Beit Jala in Palestine. And I spent an afternoon with them, and they broke open my rib cage and turned my heart in a million different directions by the power of their story. And I came away thinking that I wanted to tell that story, but then there was the question of what right did I have to tell that story? How would I write a novel about these people when they're real? The tension between fiction and nonfiction. But mostly what I wanted to do was to write a story that tried to confront the heartbreak of the world and to make some sense of it for myself, first of all, who was very confused by what was going on over there, and maybe give it to somebody else so that they can shape it and reshape it. Fiction to me, facts can be mercenary things. They can be packed off to wherever you want them to go. But fiction gets at that messy territory of the human heart where you don't actually know what's going on. All these issues of love and pride and pity and sacrifice and fiction, I suppose, in the end, is that forum in which we can really get at some of the messiness of human experience and celebrate it, because messiness is actually good, because we're diseased, I think, with certainty too much these days.
Thank you, Colm. That's terrific. We have amongst us a wonderful poet, and Jeet Thayil, and so I'd like to recite a verse from Hafiz, who's arguably the greatest Persian poet ever, and I'll recite it in Farsi because I know Farsi and I studied Hafiz for my upcoming novel. So Hafiz says, "Ghazal gufti o dar safti, ghazal gufti o dar safti, bia o khush bakhwan Hafiz, ke bar nazm to afshand, falak aqad surayara." Basically, it means, Hafiz, you said you have composed a poem like Hafiz. So come and recite your poems so that the sky can offer you a necklace of the stars. On that note, Jeet, come and tell us, how does poetry influence, or enhances your novels, your characters, your writing?
Well, the first 3 novels really had poets as characters in the novels, which I think I was just using that as an excuse to allow myself to actually have lines of poems in the text. You can't just throw in a line of or a stanza without it being embedded in some way. So, this second novel especially, I mean, these 3 novels are kind of a Bombay trilogy about the poets of Bombay over 50 years. And there are real poets, real historical figures, as well as invented poets. And all of them get a little say. And there are moments, I think, where one of the kind of themes of this novel, of this trilogy, is madness and how it affects, in particular, poets, as we know, rather more than prosers. It does hit poets in ways that are mysterious, I think. And so that allows you to do things with a novel that are purely in the realm of poetry. And because of that, there's a kind of a 4-page section in one of those novels where the history of man is told in terms of mythology in short phrases. And sometimes when I think of that, I'm just awestruck that editors allowed that through, because it really, when you read it, it really is the sound of madness. And there's a reason why poets were considered insane by some of our early commentators. Poetry was a kind of insanity because it's at that.
Hafiz was considered a madman. Hafiz was considered a madman.
So many of our early poets were, and I think a kind of understanding of madness, or allowing yourself to open that door. And we all have that door in our heads. I think poets just allow themselves to open it more and to walk through it and to see what happens once they get into that other room.
I want to read a very quick little passage from Annie's memoirs. And I'll finish off by asking Annie a question regarding that. I needed to see it written in black and white up on a wall. Jahan koi apna dafn na hua ho, wo jagah apni nahi hua karti. Traveling from Spanish to English to Urdu, that line waited to trip me up in my own language. I found it at a stall selling posters at a literary festival. It's from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. A person does not belong to a place until someone beloved is buried there. Annie, it's a fabulous beginning. And I want to ask you, because your memoirs, Bread, Cement, Cactus, is about home. It's about identity. And what, according to you, is a great beginning to a novel? How do you write a terrific beginning? How do you pen a fabulous beginning? Because this really is a lovely beginning.
Well, this is a memoir, and it came out of an essay I initially wrote, and the poster was absolutely my finding of this poster was coincidental, and it was absolutely vital to my ability to even pull together my thoughts about what I was feeling and thinking about home and belonging. In the fictional realm, I mean, I think sometimes you get really lucky when you find an opening line that just, is that actually works as an opening line. That doesn't always happen, though. I mean, in my case particularly, I tend to move things around a lot. So if the writing itself is fragmented, I don't always know that this is the beginning. Maybe I'll have to move it around and shove it into the middle of the piece somewhere. But I do think that opening lines, one way to approach it, I think, is I read many novels that I feel don't really begin where they ought to begin. Like the first 1,000 words are dull and you're kind of squirming and not sure whether this is even worth reading. And then that one line comes and you're like, here's where it starts.
Sure. Beautiful.
I think some of it is an editor's job, really. The editor should be able to pick that out and say, okay, throw that out. Or you edit yourself and you say, just distance yourself a little bit and say that this is powerful, this is vital, that it sucks you in. And if you know that this is sucking you in, even as a reader of your own text, then that is a great line, I think, to begin with.
Great. We've run out of time, but one last question to all of you, very, very quickly. Jeet, what are you working on?
I'm working on a kind of a Sebaldian mix of nonfiction and fiction and photography and illustration. And it's the kind of book where you don't know, it reads like nonfiction, but the end of it is absolutely a fictional project.
Great. Colm Tóibín, sorry, Colm Tóibín, what are we going to get next from you?
I love meeting people who tell me I'd write novels too if only I had time. But it's a terrible thing to say to a poet. If I had a year with with silence, with indoorness, with interiority, if I had a year, I think I might actually get some poems, but I would need all that lead-in time. So I have a book of poems coming, my first book of poems. I'll be 67. Far too old to be writing poems and writing the first book. So I have my first book of poems coming next year. And that's what I spend my day doing now as LA people suffer all around me, is I just write poems and I revise them, I cut them. What you're talking about, Annie, that whole idea of the first stanza is there for about 3 weeks, and one morning you wake up and you think it's awful, take it out. And the sheer freedom of that, no one will ever see this. And the second, so that's what I do. I just write poetry all day. It's what I've always wanted to do. Now that I'm old and I can't go out, that's what I'm doing, writing poetry.
Colm McCann, what are we going to be, what are you working on?
I've immediately decided that I'm going to write a novel about Colum Tóibín writing a book of poems. It'll have something to do with the doorways, not only opening the door, but taking the jams off the door and throwing the door away. But I think that's brilliant. Yeah, I'm working on a novel too. So, we'll see how it goes.
Fantastic. And finally, Annie, what's coming, to us from you?
So I have finished writing a very, very short novel. I almost hesitate to call it a novel, but yes, it is a very short novel, kind of about people and cities, and that should be published later this year.
Fabulous. What an incredible conversation with this galaxy of brilliant writers. Thank you so much, Annie. Thank you so much, Jeet. Colm, thank you so much. And Colum, thank you so much. Stay safe and see you when we can see you.
Okay, take care. Okay, bye everybody.
Thank you, Annie Zaidi. Thanks, Colum McCann. Thanks, Colm Tóibín, Jeet Thayal, and of course, Moin Mir for that brilliant conversation. Really took us to the heart of writing and the heart of fiction and everything that we love. Of course, I'd wish to be just sitting back now and picking up all of your wonderful books and reading. But you all can, even if I can't. You go right on to Amazon right now and order your books. Thank you all for watching. Being such a great audience, do stay logged on, go on to the Darbar Hall sessions or stay with us at the front lawn. Do please remember to contribute. As you all know, we are cash strapped. Thank you so much for everything that you've done. Do remember to use our hashtag at Jaipur Lit Fest is the handle, and the hashtag is Jaipur Literature Festival 2021. The festival and all of us, and hopefully you, is protected by Dettol. See you in the next session.